I ask everyone stay on mute for the time being, but I will open it up for questions a little bit later on. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation that we're going to walk through today. Okay, so like I said, the name of this session is Podcasting for Beginners. Once we get back to in-person cafes, what we're going to be doing is running this as a monthly meetup. So if you actually want to take the concrete actions that we're going to go over today in this session and actually build out your podcast, we're going to be meeting every month with about 20 to 30 people who are interested in actually designing and launching their first podcast. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to go over really briefly why you should be considering podcasting and why it's a good idea for your business. Then we're going to go over how you should be setting goals and expectations for yourself. We're going to review the different types of formats for podcasting shows. We'll review 5 very popular kinds, and I'll talk about how you can develop scripts or do live recordings for each of them. We're going to talk about what the actual steps are to start your podcast. And again, once we start back with the live cafes, we'll be able to walk you through each of these steps in person so that you can launch your first podcast too. And then lastly, we're going to be very briefly touching on how to build a listener base. How do people actually find the podcast that you publish and produce? So why podcasting? There are 3 main reasons that I point people to when they ask, why should I start a podcast? Obviously, it's become very trendy, very popular right now. I just read a stat that Apple Podcasts have over 900 million podcasts that are in production. Right now, there are about 90 million people that every day listen to at least one podcast episode. So there's a growing audience there. It's expected to grow to 122 million by 2022. So anywhere there are people that want to consume content as a business, as a brand, you have to put content in front of them for them to consume. The second major reason is we're going through a voice revolution. The future of search is going to take place over voice, over Alexa, Google Home. Any personal assistant that's developed from now on, you're going to want to have an audio avenue to engage with future search technologies. And then finally, podcasting is a great opportunity to enter the world of content creation and marketing by content. And later on in the presentation, I'm going to show you how you can take one podcast episode and transform it into about 30 to 60 different pieces of micro individual content. So setting goals. First of all, you have to be realistic when you're starting your podcast. So what goals, what expectations should you have when you start your very first podcast? And the key here is that everybody starts from 0. Every podcast out there is going to start with 0 listeners. Don't expect to grow to 1 million overnight. So the first piece of that puzzle is to be consistent with your publication so that your listeners know when you're going to be publishing episodes, and doing this over a long period of time. If you're going to grow an audience, you have to get people invested in your show so that they tell other people. Chances are, if they listen to one episode, they're not going to tell their friends about it. But if you get them hooked and consistently engaging with your content, the chances of them sharing your content grow up exponentially. Second, and this is sort of in the same vein, you want to really value interaction with your audience. If you have 5 listeners, 15 listeners, 20 listeners when you start out, engage with them. If they're willing to give you their time, you need to value that in return. See how they can get involved with the show. Get them to submit questions that you can answer on air. Submit different ideas for what type of content. Giving your audience ownership over the content that you're producing over the long run is going to have dramatically positive effects on not only your podcast show, but your brand in general. The size of your audience, like I said, is probably going to start pretty modestly, just like anything. But with enough time and consistency, you're going to see that audience growing. And then finally, don't start a podcast if you think all you're going to do is sell things. If you're looking to do direct sales, there are other avenues that are better for it. Podcasting really should be thought of as a branding and marketing activity. How do you establish your brand's voice? You literally are giving voice to the company that you're making this for. What does your company sound like? What type of content are they going to be talking about? How do they interact with their audience? Everything that your brand stands for, your podcast should stand for as well. So what are some popular formats for shows, and what's the best format for you and your level of comfort and experience? A lot of this is really going to depend on your individual voice and what you find comfortable. I know some people want to script out every last word that they're going to be talking, and that's perfectly fine. NPR does a number of shows where they're entirely scripted and then post-produced. Other people have the gift of gab, and they can just sit in front of a microphone and talk for hours on end. And there are a whole lot of things in between. So these are the 5 most popular formats for podcasting right now. And in the next slide, we'll go over the pros and cons to utilizing each of them as you start thinking about what format your show should take. So obviously on the far end of the spectrum is just doing a live recording where you're just sitting in front of a microphone. Maybe you have some bullet points or an agenda that you want to go through, and you just talk. A lot of people find this to be the easiest because there's not a ton of post or pre-production that has to go into that. So if you're looking purely to experiment, click the microphone button on your phone or your computer, record yourself for 2 minutes, for 30 minutes, however long you want to go, and see what it sounds like. It's a great starting point. If you have a hard time thinking about what you're going to talk about, interview shows and Q&A shows are really a great avenue. With Live from the Cafe, you'll notice that we do a lot of feature interviews. We interview our office holder mentors. We interview people that will be on panels for future events. And this gives us a ton of content, not only that provides value to the audience, but also works as a way to get people interested in the topic area and get them into the cafe. So that's the thought process behind doing an interview show. If you invite people onto your podcast to get interviewed, they're going to take that as a compliment. And when you have people onto your show as guests, it also gives them a digital asset to share with their network. So the network effects can be really great with doing interview shows. Once you build up a little bit of an audience, you can sort of transition into a Q&A show where people are submitting questions live, maybe on Zoom live, like this virtual session, or on Facebook Live, or maybe they email them in ahead of time. One of the things that I've done in the past before I've built up an audience and have an established avenue of engagement is I'll pretend to be different customer personas and ask questions as if they were real people. So I'll say, oh, Nikhil from Toronto is asking me about this, and then answer the hypothetical question. So feel free to get creative. Again, you're sitting behind a microphone, so people don't know what's going on behind the scenes. A segmented show or a variety show is a great way to keep your audience on their heels and keep your content fresh. This is what I do with one of my shows for an education company that I run. So it's a 4-segment show. The first segment is a discussion of a current event. The second segment is a discussion of a particular international body or segment of the United Nations. The third part is about strategy and exercises for improving debate performance. And then lastly, there's a segment for me to answer questions that I receive from my listeners. So it's a great way to really produce a show that could span, my segment show goes for 15 to 20 minutes, so each segment's about 5 minutes or so. But you could also expand and have a much longer show by segmenting into different blocks or different chops. Think about any sort of news show or late night comedy show. They all act in this segmented way where it's one block in front of the other, and you can position your best performing content at the beginning and at the end of the show to make sure that your audience stays engaged for the whole length of the episode. Instructional shows are great if there's some part of your business, your company, your brand that requires educating the customer. If you're trying to show someone how to do something, if you have a secret recipe, if whatever your magic component is, you can do an instructional show. These shows will take a little bit more pre-production time because you're going to have to really plan out what your educational content is going to be before you start recording. But it's a great way to engage passive listeners that want to learn something. And then lastly, narrative stories can be some of the most compelling audio content currently available. NPR is doing a really great job with this type of story show. Their fictional podcasts have gained a ton of popularity over the past 10 years, and it was those types of shows that really put podcasting on such a high platform recently. So when we compare these shows against one another, you'll sort of see a spectrum start to form from easy to produce to needing the most amount of time to produce, script, and then post-produce your shows. So it's really a matter of how much each of these types of shows speak to you and what you want to do with your show. The one thing I do want to make clear is that even with these 5 types of shows, you don't need to invest in any equipment. If you have a computer, if you have a phone, you can start recording. And then you can use free open source software to put your show together and then publish it to the web. And I'll show you how you can use a hosting platform, one of which I use, to push to all of these different platforms. So Live from the Cafe is on 60 different audio channels. And I don't upload 60 different versions of the show. I upload it to one host who then disseminates it to those 60 different channels. So we'll go over that in a couple minutes. So what are the actual steps to starting? What do you have to do to start your podcast? This is the roadmap that I've been using for all of the shows. I've helped produce and create about 5 different podcasting shows now, and it's the same process each time. Again, set what your objectives and figure out what format you want to experiment with. You don't have to be tied to any format, so feel free to play around with different formats as you progress through your episodes. Create branding. You may want to brand it as just your company's podcast, or you can give it a name and a brand of its own that ties in and enforces the underlying messages of your already existing brand. Then you have to choose a hosting service, figure out where your podcast is going to live online. This is the only part that's going to cost you a little bit of money, though there are free alternatives like Anchor out there that allow you to do these things for free, but I'd recommend spending a couple bucks a month to make your life a lot easier. Then you want to create bumpers for your show. So these are the intro segments and outro segments, the little transitions between segments if you want to. They're very easy to make. And once we get back into live sessions, I hope you guys come into Venture Cafe and I can show you how you can overlay voice, sound effects, and free sounds all together to make your intro and outro bumpers. So listen to an episode of Live from the Cafe and you'll see that we have a dedicated intro and outro on each of the episodes. A great resource is YouTube's free music library. That will allow you to use and download hundreds of sound effects and music that's royalty free and doesn't cost to download. So if you don't know about that resource, go and check it out. You just have to Google YouTube free sound library and it should bring you to that page. The next part is crucially important. People think that they can sit down, record, publish, and just repeat that cycle every week. That's a losing strategy because inevitably you're going to get sick. Maybe the coronavirus hits and you can no longer have sessions live in your cafe. And so you have to have a pipeline of content. I always advise people to map out and record 4 weeks of pipeline so that in those 4 weeks, if something happens and you have to miss production for 1 week, you still have 3 weeks as your barrier to when you get going again. So with Live from the Cafe, we have interviews that can fill in our time for when something like the coronavirus happens and we no longer have live sessions. We'll also be using all of these recordings. I'll strip the audio out and use those as audio as well for podcast episodes. Record and produce those episodes. So once you create your bumpers, now you just need to create your main content, and then it's just a matter of layering all those elements on top of each other. Before you even go and launch your podcast though, use the time to build your own audience. So if you already have your social channels, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, start building a mailing list specifically for your podcast. I recommend doing anywhere between 2 and 10 weeks of marketing before you publish your first episode, depending on how big and developed your current audience already is. Once you have those 4 weeks of episodes done, you can begin scheduling so that they're automatically published every Monday at 5 a.m., for example. And then the last step, and don't forget this last step, is you can then take your episode and break it down into smaller pieces of content to feed into all of those social channels. We did this a little bit with the Melissa Withers feature interview that we did on Live from the Cafe a few weeks ago. So if you go to our Instagram page, you'll see a small video preview that we made and disseminated on all of our channels. And really, that's just a starting point with what you can do. And we'll go over some strategies for that as well. I'm going to take a quick break here to see if there are some questions that I can answer. So Vera asked, is the session going to be recorded? So yes, we are video recording this session. It's going to be live, or I guess not live, but it'll be available on all of our social platforms in the coming days. And like I said, I'm also taking the audio out of each of the virtual sessions, and those will become podcast episodes. So however you want to consume our content, we want to make sure that it's available to you. Another great question that I got from Eric, are these slides going to be available separately? That's a good question. I think that is something that we should do. I think we should probably publish a page up on the website that'll have this information for people to click through. But until that's done, you can also watch and speed through the recording of this episode as well. And if you have any other questions, keep sending them in. I'll stop from time to time to answer them as well. Let's talk about what resources are available to start your podcast. These are the big 3 that I point people to. If you don't know how to design a podcast cover, you don't have a graphic gift, if you will, Fiverr is a great place to go and get a pretty cheap podcast cover done and get some branding done for your marketing for the brand of that podcast. So that's the resource that I recommend there. For editing software, I'm a huge fan of Audacity. It's open source, which means it's free. It's pretty intuitive, and the best part is whatever you need to learn how to do, YouTube is going to be your best friend, because you're going to go to YouTube and you're going to say, how do I use Audacity to remove background noise? How do I use Audacity to make crossfades? How do I use Audacity to whatever? You're going to find a video answer, because there are a ton of free resources. So it's just a matter of will and putting the time into getting this done. And then my host of choice is a startup out of Florida called Buzzsprout. Their hosting plans will cost somewhere between 12 and 24 hours a month, depending on how much content, the length that you want to upload every month. So all you have to do once you create your Buzzsprout account, they're going to walk you through the steps about how to submit your podcast to Apple, to Google, to Spotify, to Stitcher, to TuneIn, to Alexa. All of those platforms are included once you start using the Buzzsprout channel. And for full transparency, they are not paying me to say any of this. I am just a loyal customer. So I'm not getting any referral money here. Check out Buzzsprout if you're looking for a great podcast host. What are some equipment options? Again, you do not need to spend a dime on equipment. If you decide you want to take the next steps, you can buy a single microphone if you're just going to be doing shows that you're recording, single person recordings yourself. My choice is the Blue Snowball that I actually have right here. It's about $50, great audio quality, records about 90 degrees in front of the microphone. So you could theoretically have a conversation in front of it if you position the microphone far enough away. If you want to up your level or be a little bit more mobile, the Zoom recorders are great options, and they now have 6 generations that are designated with an H. So any of the generations of the Zoom recorders give you additional functionality. We have one here at the cafe. That's how we record our panel discussions. When we have multiple people using multiple microphones, the Zoom recorders are a great option when you're ready to take that next step and want to invest into some professional technology. So what is the actual process of capturing and purposing and redistributing all of the content that you produce? Unless your podcast really is time sensitive, where you're talking about the news or current events, here's a real big tip. Constantly be republishing all of the episodes that you've recorded. So if you have a great feature interview that you recorded last year, push it out again. Develop some sort of cycle so that you're constantly pushing through content that you may think is old, but may still have a lot of relevance for your new listeners. So maybe you set goals for yourself that every time I get 10 more listeners, I republish all of my episodes on all of my social channels. It's a great way to get all of these different things involved and working for you. So when you think about the process for a single episode, think about it in these 4 steps. 1, it's capturing it, it's recording it. That's what we're doing right here, is that I'm recording all of this audio. That's the first step. The second step is producing it. So once this session is done, once the video is done, we're going to be able to strip the audio out. I'll be able to add those intro and outro bumpers, maybe throw an ad in there, and then we have the production element done, and I can upload and publish that full episodes to all of those different platforms that we talked about. The next part is contextualizing episodes or snippets of these episodes for different platforms. So I can take this video of the whole session and maybe just this screen, I want to record a shorter video that tend to perform better, something like a 2 to 5 minute video that performs better on Facebook, and post it there. For the whole video, I could publish that directly onto LinkedIn, or again, I can create smaller sound bites of it. So if you go to the Venture Cafe Cambridge Instagram page right now, you'll see that Melissa Withers tile that I made. That's a video. You sort of see the sound waves going, and it's a 1 minute segment of that 15-minute interview that I did with her. So really figuring out what formats will work best for which platforms is a really key part to delivering content and growing your audience base. And then finally, scheduling everything for distribution. So once you have that episode published, then being able to break it down, or you should theoretically have broken it down before the episode publishes, and then schedule all of those smaller micro pieces of content. I see I got a couple more questions, so we're going to take a look at those real quick. So bumpers are those intro and outro bits. They're like 5 to 15 seconds. They can be as long as 2 minutes. Video bumpers are a little bit easier to explain. So think about when you tune into CNN and there's breaking news and a whole bunch of things start flashing all over the screen before they get into the segment. That's a bumper. And the same is true in an audio context. Rob asks, as an organization looking to assess whether podcasts make sense or not, what do you recommend as a test or way to learn on a go or no-go decision? I'll answer that question first. Go. Is it commit to making 4 episodes and then assessing the results? And what are some metrics that you track? All right, so metrics and judging the success have to be done on a internal basis. So if you're a single person that is starting a brand for yourself and you have no audience, your metric of success may be, I want 10 dedicated listeners. If you're a Fortune 500 company launching a podcast, that metric is going to be different. So it really depends contextually on what you're trying to do. That's really the answer to that. Some of the key metrics to pay attention to: how many subscribers do you have across all of the different channels? How many listeners do you have? Because those are 2 different metrics. A subscriber is someone who's actually clicked subscribe to that show on Apple or Spotify or Stitcher. A listener is somebody who may have come across your show, listened to 1 episode, but isn't subscribed to the channel, which is why you're constantly hearing people say, remember to subscribe, which is why I keep bringing up the Live from the Cafe podcast, because I hope that you subscribe to that. Another important metric is listen rate and drop-off points. So you want to see if people are listening to the entire length of your episode. Does 70% of your audience drop out after 5 minutes, in which case maybe you shorten your episode span to 5 minutes? There's no concrete evidence that any particular length of a podcast will fare better than another one. So there are podcasts that I listen to that are 4 minutes long. There are other podcasts that I listen to that are 2 hours long. It depends on your audience, and you have to keep playing around and experimenting with these different formats. Let's see if I can get back to the questions. Lots of questions. I will try to get to them all. If you're a startup and have no clients, should podcasting be your focus? And if not, when's the best timing? The best timing is right now. Go out and do it. Go and make it, because nothing is stopping you. $12 a month, if you can't afford that, then you should probably reassess your priorities. But I hope that you can afford $12 a month to start your podcast. In order to get an audience, you have to deliver some sort of value to a potential audience. You have to give people some reason to become your audience, to become your evangelists, to become your biggest fans. And I find podcasting to be a good route to that. I personally hate being on camera. Like, this is torture for me right now. I hate being able to see myself. I hate being able to see other people interacting with the video. I want to sit behind a microphone and I just want to talk and publish that and post-produce that on top of a still image. That's what I feel more comfortable with. So that's why podcasting has always resonated with me, because it's something that I found naturally easy to do. If you love being in front of a camera, for God's sake, go in front of a camera and make these shows. Then strip the audio out and use it as an audio-only option. So there are people that want to consume content in all of these different formats. So give it to them in all of these different formats. Let's see what else I got. Length of podcasts, I sort of talked about that already. Depends on what comes more naturally to you and what your audience wants to listen to. What are your thoughts on video podcasting or using YouTube? That's a great question. A lot of interesting options there. Again, it depends on your level of expertise, your level of commitment, and your level of comfort. So if you really want to do video, if you want to, you can do a live stream like this. We had some technical difficulties this week with our YouTube live streaming, but next week we'll have all of these sessions live streaming on YouTube. Or you can record it, post-produce it, and then publish it to YouTube, right? Think about how many radio talk shows are also used on television. The Rush Limbaugh show. I'm trying to think of some others. That Don Imus show always used to do this too, right? It was talk radio that also had a TV video component to it, whether it's live or pre-recorded. Totally up to you. That's why podcasting is such a great medium, because it has a lot of flexibility with different ways that you can use the content. And let's see if I can take one more question before I click to the next slide. Did you talk about monetizing? How do you get sponsorship? If you're just starting out, how long will it take to get an ad on your podcast? Great question. If you're starting a podcast to make money, if you're looking at advertising as a way to monetize your podcast, you just honestly are going to need tens, if not hundreds of thousands of listeners. And before you get to tens and hundreds of thousands of listeners, you need to be producing the content. So you have to think about your podcast, your brand. What would it take for you to advertise on somebody else's podcast? So always consider the opposite foot and how you're going to create value for a potential advertiser. I'm not a huge fan of trying to monetize podcasts because it really changes the total dynamic that you have with your audience. I think it should be purely used as a branding play and a lead gen tool for your brand. But if you're committed to monetizing and trying to get sponsorship, you better be a machine with producing high quality content that attracts a lot of listeners. One avenue you can do, there are a bunch of different forums where you can trade ads with other small podcasts. So you can find another podcast that's maybe adjacent to your niche that you think may share some common listeners and offer to do an ad exchange with them. It's a great way to expose your audience to a different show that may add value in a different way other than what you provide. And it's also a great way to get your name in front of a totally different audience that you don't have exposure to. Buzzsprout, back to the hosting service that I use, actually has a really great virtual community where every Wednesday you can volunteer to be on somebody else's show as a guest, or there are ad exchanges on that platform as well. So I see that the chat blinking, and I got a bunch of other questions. I promise I'm going to try to get to them, but let me see if I can jam through a couple more slides. So this is sort of on topic. How do you get listeners? And this is what I was talking about before. So let's use Live from the Cafe as the case example of how we're building our audio-only audience for Venture Cafe Cambridge. So obviously your primary distribution channels are how people are going to listen to your full-length episodes. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Alexa, TuneIn, iHeartRadio. There are literally hundreds of different platforms. Again, you need to be on them all. They all have slightly different audiences that they cater to. So make sure that the content that you produce works well on each of those main primary channels. Secondary distribution channels, this is what we were talking about a little while ago in terms of YouTube or video produced podcasts. It's a great secondary avenue. And even if you don't have a video component, you can just have a web link too, because more and more people are using YouTube Red and their music streaming service. So again, it's another avenue. And if people want to listen on there, you got to be there. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of contextualizing your content to different platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. When you have guests on in particular, when you're featuring people, making sure to tag their handles, to ask them to share. One of the things that we do is that after we have a feature interview, I send a one-pager to those guests with pre-written tweets, Facebook posts, LinkedIn posts, and Instagram images and video that they can put on all of their channels. So make it easy for people to share the content that you're creating. And then the last avenue I'll sort of touch on is not ignoring the written word. So transcribing all of these episodes, writing summaries, making sure that you're utilizing any sort of written content to optimize for search engine results. So right now, this audio only version of the session isn't going to get the Google web and mobile search results. It's starting to play a little bit into Home Assistant results, but it's still not quite there yet. We're not all the way there. But transcribing this, writing this down in paragraph form will have a huge impact on generating traffic to your website, which in return hopefully will generate listeners to your podcast. So those are different ways to attract an audience. Again, I'm not a believer in growth hacking. So if you know how to growth hack an audience, you do you. I'm a believer in growing an organic, genuine audience, because those people are going to stick with you for the longest time, and they're more likely to convert to paying customers and leads than trying to get thousands of listeners through link shares and things like that. Let's go back to the chat real quick. Do we have any questions from Facebook Live? How do you measure lead gen from a podcast? That's a great question. Who asked that? Holly? That's a good question. So there are a couple of different tactics that you can try. You can do your own ads for your own products in your content, in your audio content, and then provide codes for free trials or for discounts. And that way you can track a little bit more. You can also, once people become a lead, depending on how you capture that, if you're capturing email addresses or free trials or whatever, asking the question, where did you find out about us? What made you do this? So ask those questions to your audience, because you'll get a ton of really valuable information. And then once you've been doing this for a while, once you've been generating that audience and those leads, figuring out what the metrics are. Because if you are able to say for every 3 podcast episodes that you do, you're able to generate 3 leads, depending on the value of your lead, you now have more of an incentive. You're going to want to create those 3 podcast episodes as quickly as possible. Maybe it's like every time you publish 4 episodes per week, you get X number of leads. So tracking all of those metrics, critically important to measuring the success of your own podcast. Back to the chat for some more questions. Brad recommends using Epidemic Sound for music. I haven't heard of that resource, but I'm going to check it out now. My preferred venue is YouTube royalty-free music. Real easy to use, pretty intuitive, great selection. I don't know how you can improve. So there's a question here. How can you improve your voice or articulation? Are there training sites for having your own radio voice? I don't know. I've never looked. I say just be you, be genuine. I think people react to that more than trying to sound professional. The fact of the matter is you're going to say like I just did. You're going to stumble over words. Don't try to be perfect, because perfection is going to be the enemy of success in this instance. There are a bunch, Kevin makes a really good point that there are a ton of inexpensive audio to text applications to do transcribing. AI is really revolutionizing this field. So yes, there are a ton of resources. If you don't want to transcribe, and please do not sit down and transcribe every word of your podcast, use one of these tools. And there are a number of different tools out there. Do some Googling, you'll find a great option really quickly. Oh, and that looks like that was the end of the presentation anyway. In conclusion, just start. Just start producing content, start publishing, start figuring out how to best contextualize for your platforms, figure out how to best engage your audience, whether it's a dial-in Q&A show with email, pre-advanced screening, question and answer, give your audience opportunities to shape the show, tape in a whole bunch of different varieties of formats and poll for what they like most. Let's see if I have any more questions. If anybody wants to come off mute and ask a question, now would be the time. Do we need a mixer or just a normal iPhone? Again, whatever you want to use just to start. Just start doing it. An iPhone is perfectly fine. If you don't know how to use a mixer, then don't buy a mixer. That's something that you can get to later on down the line. I used my phone for my first podcast, and that's all I did was I talked into my phone, emailed myself the audio file, and then uploaded it. Do I know of any good books or sites as references? No. I listen to podcasts, and listening to podcasts, I think, are going to be your best option to learn how to do them. So if anybody wants to jump on to the audio and ask a question, we have about a little less than 10 minutes to take questions, if anyone has anything specific.
Mary here, just a quick one. I was intrigued and a bit surprised to see you had rated the call in with Q&A as kind of low to medium effort. How do you even set that up?
So that's a great question, Mary, and that depends on the level of complexity that you want. If you want to do it live, it's going to be more complicated. My suggestion for starting out is have people email you or message you questions that you can be like, okay, Mary from so-and-so is asking this question. This is how I'm going to answer it. Or if you want to get a little bit more fancy, you can have somebody else, maybe a coworker or colleague, say, Mary from so-and-so is asking this question. Frank, what do you think? And then you can answer that question. If you're going to do live back and forth with someone, you can use Zoom is actually a pretty good platform because you can record the entire session, strip out the audio, and then do some post-production. So it depends on how much time you want to put into publishing those first episodes.
Thank you.
This is Josh. Quick question. When you write up your little write-up for the sites, the hosting sites, how do you think about how to? It's almost SEO there, like keywords and search and stuff like that. How do you think about that?
That's a good question. I haven't actually provided web content other than providing. So Buzzsprout will create a snippet code that you can just upload as HTML onto any site with just any one particular episode. So I do include that in the one pager. So if they want to include the, click play to play the whole episode. I've done that. But I haven't really given guidance on how to write like a whole blog post or summary. That's actually a really good idea because you can actually ask them to give you a backlink to link to your site, which is just going to help everybody's SEO. So I think I may be going back. They may be a 2-pager from now on. All right, I think I have some questions in chats right now. Can I talk about tagging and metadata? I can't believe I didn't talk about that. Kevin, thank you for that prompt. That's a great question. Tagging is incredibly important on all of these platforms because that's how people you don't know are actually going to organically find your podcast, whether that's on Spotify or on Apple Podcast, on Stitcher, whatever tags, whatever topics they're already following. If you fit into that, that's how you're going to get found organically on those primary distribution channels. So you want to use, I always tell people to use as many tags as they can and be specific with what they're tagging. So if I were to tag this podcast, for example, right, podcasting, it's like SEO. It's like a keyword on SEO. There are going to be thousands and thousands and millions of results for that. But getting more specific with your tags, how to start a podcast for beginners, beginner podcasting tactics, any of the resources that I mentioned, I would probably be tagging all of them too. I sort of think about it as like any proper noun I would also be tagging. I'd be tagging people's names because if people are searching in Google for somebody's full name, there's a chance your podcast could come up because you've tagged them in that. So tagging is really important. And then with Audacity, you can set all of the metadata in the file, also extremely important. So you can set the name of your podcast, the host, you can do the year, I think you can put a description in there. So fill out all of the metadata. The more work you put into making it easier for the search engines to use and search through your audio content, the better it's going to be for you in the long term. For organizations, do you feel that production quality is higher, Rob asks, and should organizations be investing more upfront, or is it better to see what's working first or not? It depends on how much of your company's money you want to blow. If you're given a budget, man, go for it. If you want to be a hero, really get in the dirt and see what's working. I'm a big fan, and I probably shouldn't be saying this because my manager is watching, but ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Start making something, produce things, and then if you get in trouble for it, apologize later on. Personal advice, up to you. But in terms of production value, I think you'd be amazed at how high of a production value you can get at a very simple tools and very easy editing. Audacity is a great tool because you can strip out all the background noise, and that alone is really going to increase the quality of your production. Okay, so it looks like I am just about out of time. Shaheen just messaged to the group, if you can do us a huge favor and provide us feedback on this session. There's a link right there. It starts with bcproject.herokuapp.com. Please click on that link. It's a 1-question survey, 1 to 10. So make sure to do that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into the first virtual session of Venture Cafe Cambridge. Any other questions, feedback, advice, email us at info@vencaf.org. Our next session, Pivot to Profitability with Eric Ashman, begins at 6 o'clock. Go back to that page, the virtual cafe page, to click into that session. That'll be starting in about 15 minutes. Thank you guys all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed.